Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon and welcome to Casa Árabe. I'm Karim and I'm in charge of international politics at this Casa Árabe. And we'd like to welcome you warmly to talk about women and political resistance in Yemen. Yemen, of course, is a country which is of great concern to us, and it should certainly concern those who write and who take decisions on international politics more. And we believe that it is a country that does not get a lot of attention and is going through a profound crisis which has very serious humanitarian consequences. And the United Nations has said that there is a cholera outbreak, there's hunger that is extensive there, and so this is the time that we find ourselves in currently. Nevertheless, it is important to talk about Yemen, not only in terms of the last 2 years, but also we need to go back to the beginning of what is referred to as the Arab Spring and see what the role has been of women during this process. And for this purpose, we have invited our guests and speakers today. Afrah Nasser is a journalist and Yemeni blogger who is visiting us from Switzerland. Eva Strevleska, I'm not sure if I've pronounced your name correctly, who is a postdoctorate researcher from the University of Nova in Lisbon. And we also have Leyla Hamad, who will be moderating the session, and she is a researcher from the Political Observatory, Electoral Observatory from the Arab world and Muslim world. And then we'll have an opportunity for you to all ask questions or make comments. I'd like to remind you that outside we have 2 books, one of them written by Dr. Eva Straleska, who has just published the book, and it has been possible to publish the book thanks to the TESIC. And also there's a book, Leyla Hamad is co-author of the book, which we have out there as well, and which has been available for a couple of years now. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to our moderator for this evening. You have the floor. Hello and good evening and welcome to all of you. I'd like to thank these 2 speakers on behalf of Casa Árabe. They're both specialists who know a great deal about women and who have worked extensively with regards to activism, and not only on matters to do with feminism, but also political matters in Yemen, as from 2011 onwards and the revolution. To talk about Yemen is always essential because Yemen is a country which has been forgotten mainly. Very little is spoken about this country. And it's a country that deserves to be spoken about. And it's well worth telling people what is happening there. And if talking about it is important, it's even more important to talk about Yemeni women, which is a particularly vulnerable group. And I don't want to go into too many details because the specialists in this field are them, but I would like to talk about, or give you a bit of data that will give you an idea. We're talking about Yemen. It's a country that has 27 million inhabitants. The population is under 25 years old, is 63%. So we're talking about a country here which is very young in nature and which, in addition, is living through a humanitarian disaster, which is really terrible. With the cholera disease now, for example, and I will touch upon this very briefly, women and how cholera affects them in particular. And there are some statistics that we have which are alarming. 27% of the population is unemployed, 54% of people are living under the national threshold for poverty. And if we go into gender data, the Economic Forum talks about imbalances between gender, and it places Yemen always as last on the list on its ranking. And we're talking about a place where there's 45% illiteracy rates, 66% of girls are schooled versus 79% of boys. And if we talk about secondary education, it's 21% versus 46%. So I don't want to go into further details here because I'm sure that Eva in particular will talk about women's participation in politics and in Parliament in 2011. She was a member of Parliament. Out of the 301 members of Parliament, only one was a woman, and in the consultancy body, which is a body, or the advisory body, which is, it appoints people. There were only 2 women there and 2 ministers out of the 33 ministers in the country. And in addition, there's discrimination that takes place that has to do with divorce, child custody, and inheritance. I'm not going to go into those details either. There's tribal law as well, Sharia law, which is the only source of Yemeni legislation. And also we have tribal law, which catalogues or describes women as the weaker sex that needs to be protected, and it also places them in a more vulnerable situation. So, faced with this situation, we come to the year 2011, and there are a series of activist women who have appeared that go to live there through this change, and they live through this political activism. And amongst them, we have one of their representatives, Afrah Nasser, here with us, who was in Yemen to begin with. Then she had to go into exile and went to Switzerland. And Afrah Nasser has a blog, which is essential for those of us who are researchers in Yemen. And I mentioned before, it's essential. I lived in Yemen in 2011, and every week I went into Afrah's blog to see what was going on. And then we have Eva, who is a researcher too, and we owe a lot to her. Yemenis do too, not only feminists and Yemeni feminism, but also political activism owes a great deal to this researcher, who has done a great deal and has published a lot on this matter. And this is why I believe I should give them the floor. I'm going to ask both of them to be fairly brief. They will have 20 minutes each to talk, so that we have enough time afterwards for questions, and then we can have a brief debate on this very interesting and passionate matter. Ewa, you have the floor. Thank you very much. And good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Casa Árabe, and thank you to the CSIC, and to Francisco Javier, the director of the body, and for giving me the opportunity to publish a book on Yemen, because, as you said, Yemen is a country that's ignored and very little known in Spain. And the book that's just been published together with us is a great contribution. And it's to know a little bit more about what's happening in. So I feel very privileged to be able to share this panel with Leyla, who is a great expert on Yemen, and also Afrah, who is an activist. One of the few activists that I was not unable to interview for my book, unfortunately. But we have her amongst us today, so it will be extremely interesting to complete the story about women during this Arab Spring, which, as I say, has been described in the book. Given the fact that I've been asked to speak here, I've prepared a fairly long presentation, so as we've been told we can only talk for 20 minutes, I will cut this back, and I'll just talk about the main events so that you can understand what happened, and so that you can understand the main parts of history that have to do with women's movements in Yemen. Yemen is a country which is, at least in the last few years, always ranked in the last positions in terms of gender equality. On an international scale, that is. But we also have to take into account that statistics do not always give us the full picture. They don't always tell us the full truth. And in fact, when I went to Yemen in 2007, I was able to get in touch with activists there who were carrying out a great job there. And therefore, the situation of women in civil society was not reflected in these statistics. And for this reason, we always need to take into account that statistics do not always tell us the full story. I therefore find it very important to talk about this story which is rather invisible for different reasons. I also insist on the fact that the participation of women during the Arab Spring had to do with the pre-existing elements of a political culture of feminist resistance. This is something where the women's participation in the uprisings didn't just start from scratch. There's a story behind it. There's the story of civil society that we have to take into account as well. Having said this, I would like to underline the huge mobilization of women in these uprisings in Yemen, because from what I've been able to see myself, it was women together with young people who began those uprisings in Yemen. It was women together with young people who convened or called for these big uprisings against the president, Aryab al-Assad. And it's very important to take this into account because, well, just to give you an example, there's one of the most well-known women who won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2011. Before the uprisings, Tawakkol Karman had her own organization, but also since 2007, every Tuesday she used to organize a series of demonstrations in front of Parliament, and she would request reforms. She demanded that there should be freedom of speech, for example, and many other matters. When the Arab Spring took place and when the first leaders fell, for example, as happened in Egypt and Tunisia, civil society and some other activists, such as this lady in question, changed what they were requesting for. They no longer asked for reforms of the system, but rather a radical change in the system. And this is a good example of how this reformist movement became a revolutionary movement. And of course, we also have to underline the fact that this lady was not the only lady, and perhaps it's not the best example of a feminist woman, but it was this type of women who were leaders, who were part of an Islamist movement even, who played a very important role, because that is how change was brought about in their communities, thanks to the visibility that these women had. I'd also like to underline the fact that I carried out my research in Sana'a, before, during, and after the Arab uprisings. But I do want to point out that what happened in the square in Sana'a was very important, because in 2011 it was a great opportunity for different groups that may not have had much to do with this, and they didn't even know each other's, the different tribes, for example, and civil society, young people, women, feminists, and they were able to camp out in the same place throughout many months. And that gave way to a new space for interaction to take place, and it was an opportunity for them to get to know each other. And this was of great importance because in this square of change, activist women have taken the opportunity to offer courses, workshops, and to raise awareness amongst society and the community, and also to raise awareness amongst women about their rights. So there were quite a lot of stereotypes amongst the society as a whole. But I also want to show you some photographs now in order to underline the importance of the participation of women in these uprisings, women who were leaders during the uprisings, and they appeared in the media too. And a great deal of visibility was given to them in this respect. These were women who were able to express themselves and talk about their own programs in front of crowds of men even. So a lot of taboos were broken away with, especially during the first stage of uprisings, because during the first stage of those uprisings, which was before the political parties and tribes and other movements, Islamic movements, joined the uprising or the revolution, this square of change saw a group of young people there and women Oh, I've just forgotten what I was going to say, says the speaker. Well, perhaps it wasn't too important what I was going to say. Ah, yes, I know. I wanted to say that it was a square where a space was created for a new culture. Women were allowed to do more than what they're normally allowed to do in normal circumstances. So quite a lot of taboos were broken, as I said. This is Tawakkol Karman with her Nobel Peace Prize, as I mentioned before. And in the second stage of the revolution, when the more established political parties joined the uprising, then we saw that there was a backward movement in terms of the liberation of women, and a step back was taken. It is then that feminist women also decided to join other women and to build their own feminist agenda within those uprisings. And that is important to take into account because right from the beginning, these activists have fought and have realized that it was necessary to listen to the voice of women and to speak out about their requests and demands as part of a wider fight for democracy, dignity, and justice. I'm not sure, how much time have I got left? Yes, I would like to just mention that one important thing is the relationship between violence and the feminist struggle. These women were demanding more liberation, more equality, gender equality, and it was these women who, right from the second stage of the revolution, who were persecuted. There was defamation against them. They were eliminated from these public spaces, or removed from them, rather. And on the 15th of April 2011, in a speech, it was said that genders could not mix in this square of change. And this was a speech that Islam has used in a political manner in order to create a conflict amongst different groups and within the anti-governmental group and movement. It has been a discourse and speech that has created a great deal of controversy within this square of change, because many of these activist women, together with young people, decided to march together, to demonstrate together in order to protest against that discourse or speech. But Islamist parties called for a demonstration just for women, recognizing to a certain extent that Islam prohibits the mixing of different genders. So there are different ideologies that clashed, really. So these women decided to demonstrate with men, and so therefore many of them were battered and beaten up by some extremists in the revolutionary group. But from that moment on, we do start to see how these extremists and Islamic fundamentalists and those men who had more of a patriarchal mindset decided to start changing their discourse, and they no longer were asking for equality between genders and human rights, but rather they started to try and talk about moral issues in terms of Islam. And we're talking about two different languages here. One is human rights and the other is morality. And so these women were accused of not being good Muslims, for example. Another example of what happened after April, after the Abdul Aritsa's speech, at the beginning of the uprisings, men and women more or less participated jointly in demonstrations in the square, and after there was an invisible wall because of traditions, but it wasn't until April, May, when an actual more visible barrier was created in order to separate men and women. So I was particularly interested in this barrier that started to become a higher and higher wall. And I was interested, as I was saying, to see how activist women and other women saw this symbolic separation of men and women, this Islamic separation that wanted to separate the male world from the female world. So activist women started a campaign against that wall in an attempt to say that the wall itself not only was about the separation of genders, but that there was a political issue, an ideological issue behind it. And so therefore they tried to renegotiate with the Islamic movement to bring about change in those cultural matters and gender matters. In addition, the awareness that women have had and the fear that they had lost to respond to violence that was taking place in the revolutionary camps and also outside of them. I've mentioned this because everything that had to do with the transition process was controversial, because it was the Gulf Corporation's initiative where women and young people who were the engines of the Arab uprisings were they were persecuted by the President Sarvet and the opposition parties, but nevertheless, women, despite all of this, were able to participate in the national dialogue, and there were 28% women present. So as Leyla said, this has been very important, very relevant, because we have a significant number of women in these spaces where decisions were taken with regards to the future of Yemen. But it wasn't just any old women. They were women from different political parties or from different social movements, but also activist women, feminist women who have in general, been able to renegotiate certain reforms on gender matters. These reforms, for example, the quota system is something that was achieved or something where progress was made in this respect, and there will be a 30% quota in governmental bodies, which is a change that is very significant because it's gone from 0.3% up to 30%. So we can see that this is a visible change. Another thing that was achieved was consensus in creating a minimum age for marriage. For both genders, it was going to be 18 years old, the minimum age to get married. And there are a lot of other progress was made too. And all of this is reflected in the draft of the new constitution. But this draft was never actually approved because in January of 2015, the Houthis decided to pick up their weapons and to resort to violence in order to establish their political agenda. And the conflict has become worse with military intervention from Saudi Arabia, which started on the 25th of March 2015 and which has lasted until today. So, what is the role of Spain? Spain, for example, is the third exporter of weapons in 2015 to Saudi Arabia. And these are the weapons, or at least some of these weapons are used by Saudi Arabia against, or they're used in Yemen. So I just want to mention this so that we can organize a campaign, weapons under control, in the hands of NGOs and other organizations, and we need to inform more on this matter. What are the conflicts of armed conflicts? Well, of course, as Leyla has mentioned, I'm not going to repeat them, but 82% of society requires urgent humanitarian aid, and this means that the situation of women has not only worsened, but gender violence has increased in the last 2 years of conflict by 63%. So it is clear that women are part of the most vulnerable population. And obviously, women have been excluded from the dialogue for peace, and only in the last round of peace talks in Kuwait have 7 independent activist women been able to participate and to put forward their agenda. But I did want to point out all the resistant movements that exist despite this conflict. It's resistance of young people as well as women. And here we can see street art, for example, and also there's the fight for the survival of women and the importance of women in humanitarian aid activities, which is taking place, and how society organizes itself in order to help others. Obviously, women too act as volunteers, and in the last 9 months, Yemeni women who work for the government have not received a salary, so therefore the situation is extremely serious. People go to work without actually getting paid for going to work. I would like to underline the importance of those women who organize educational courses in their homes for this new generation of children, so that it's not a lost generation. This resistance is no longer at a political level. it's also for survival purposes. Another important aspect is that they continue to break away with the cultural taboos. For example, in Sana, there is a claim to ensure that women can use bicycles as a means of transport because of the crisis and the fuel crisis in particular. So now, just to finish off, this brings me to the end of my presentation. There's a big difference with men in the sense that activists and feminist women, above all, have understood very clearly that the revolution in Yemen and uprisings in Yemen, in order to be able to turn into a true revolution, requires not only a political change, but also a social change, a change in mindsets, a cultural change. And I want to quote Bashtel Magdadi, who is one of the Thais activists, a woman who is part of the Socialist Party, and she said the revolution is not limited to places, the revolution is the pen, the revolution is the change. And I'd like to end here because this quote truly reflects what women are claiming and the participation of activist women in the uprisings in Yemen. It's not only a political revolution, it's a cultural revolution too, a revolution that aspires to bring about a true change. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Eva.
Thank you very much. Let's now give the floor to Afrah Nasser.
Hello? Do you hear me? Hello? Yes. It's very interesting hearing to you, but and I'm like there are a few aspects that will be repeated in my speech, but I think given how Yemen is getting little amount of attention, it's okay to repeat. So thank you, Casa Árabe, for the invitation. It's my first time to be in Spain, and I'm very pleased to be here. I actually forgot how it feels to be sweating since I live in Sweden. So in a time, Yemen is not getting sufficient attention in the media and international platforms. Today's event at least revived the hope for me that there are still a sense of international solidarity, or at least an interest to know about the grave tragedy unfolding in Yemen. I was asked to present an outlook on Yemeni women's political engagement, starting from Yemen's 2011 uprising towards the course of the ongoing multi-fronts Yemen war in about 10 minutes or so, which would be really impossible to do. So I will try to narrow down the outlook and explore Yemeni women's position in politics briefly within three main phases, which you mentioned about. So before the uprising, and during the uprising, and after the uprising. So the uprising for me is like the defining moment, really. The uprising that I personally owe so much to in establishing my own political awareness and activism. As a Yemeni working as a journalist since late 2008, I don't believe in objective journalism any longer. In fact, I believe in reflective journalism, a journalism that aims to challenge power and question those on power. And as a woman, I would be lying if I say that I'm not biased to women. So today, you're hearing to the perspective of a feminist and reflective Yemeni journalist. This is very crucial to stress on at the very beginning, because the polarization in Yemen war compels you to identify your position in any Yemen-related political debate. Many say if you are pro this, it means you are against that, and vice versa. For me, I'm anti-war, mainly because war is a gender issue. Women tend to be the first victims of wars, and my fellow women are bearing the greatest burden of the war. With that said, I'm not dismissing the many powerful survivor and hero Yemeni women that we have, but I also define myself as anti-violence committed by all warring sides because I refuse to be biased. All sides are evil, butchering Yemeni lives with impunity, and these atrocities must be condemned from all and anyone. Now, in exploring the situation of Yemeni women, I prepared this slide show a few pictures that could really help me to illustrate, my thoughts. So they often say that behind every great man is a great woman, and I would say behind every great woman is a great woman. This is my mother. This great mother fought 5 years at courts to get divorced from my abusive father. Despite that, the two Yemens, the north and the south, were the first countries in the Arabian Peninsula to issue a comprehensive marriage law. Gender justice was a battleground for many decades in Yemen. As time is limited, I can only say that by 1992, a joint personal status law was established, which not only mixed local custom with Sharia, but it also left marriage laws change in time, echoing the general political debates. This greatly undermined women's rights, and a well-known example of that could be seen in the child marriage issue. While more than half of Yemen's female population are married off before they reach 18, and while Yemen's female population endures one of the highest maternity mortality rate in the world, as they are often mothers at age of 9 or 10 or 13, both institutionalized system and the devastating economic situation allow this practice to happen. Women's rights campaigners have exerted, this is Afrah Nasser, one of the very active campaigners against child marriage. So women's rights campaigners have exerted great effort to legally ban child marriage. And here is a picture of a protest in front of Yemen's parliament in Sana'a in 2010, calling for the ban, and that's actually me holding that ban. But next day, you will find an Islamist party, the Islah Party, mobilizing its women to hold a counter-protest to the previous one, basically to support child marriage. So when the revolution came, women were the ones leading the uprising in 2011. Nobel laureate Tawakkol Karman, as you mentioned, Eva, is the most well-known example. And also the uprising represented an opportunity for other female opinion leaders, activists, writers, and intellectuals to challenge the social construction that was boxing and demeaning them. Unfortunately, women were used also as a decorative tool by different male-dominated political parties in the uprising. Beyond that superficial role, they were not welcomed. Only one protest defined that manipulative usage as it tried to embracing a conscious feminist vision, but it had an unfortunate end. So in April 2011, a group of women activists wanted to make a feminist and political statement in responding to the decree by Ali Abdullah Saleh in which he was, condemning the mixing of genders in the protest, which is a tactic that he uses to really divide and rule. He's very well known of that tactic, and he used it very cleverly during the uprising to divide that kind of cohesion between the female and male protesters. So in response to that protest went on the street in a mixed gender protest. The female protest and their male supporters marched together and they were attacked immediately there on the street by men affiliated to affiliated to the Islah political party, another general army man, Ali Muhsin, the powerful army man who held power at that time. And the lesson learned by many, including myself, was that Yemen men's political power was larger than women's feminist power. And when the political transition process began in 2013, women fought for and won a quota of 30% representation in the National Dialogue Conference. But with the Houthi takeover in September 2014, the transition process has taken a violent turn. And the attempts to launch a peace process, the need for women's participation in negotiation was hardly mentioned. At that time, when the different factions were approached by female political activists, the parties used to say that it's not priority now to include women. Once peace prevails, women can join, as if women's role was secondary. And fast forward, as the Saudi-led coalition began its military operation in March 2015, and this picture is taken, amidst of the ongoing war. That was also the starting point for not only worsening the already fragile humanitarian situation in Yemen, but also the collapse of any existing semi-political process in the country. So today, after about 2.5 years of multi-front armed confrontation across the countries, Yemenis are being trapped and starved into death. Today, the largest humanitarian catastrophe or a crisis in the world is in Yemen. It's even beyond Syria or anywhere else. So according to the UN reports, more than 10,000 people have been killed so far. And I'm certainly that the number or the death toll is higher than that number, because generally, if the bullets won't kill you, the famine and the almost totally paralyzed healthcare system and the spread of diseases like cholera will kill you. And I've lost count of how many of my relatives or friends of friends or friends that I know have been, killed because of the consequence of the collapse of the healthcare system or the spread of diseases and so on. About 17 million people are barely surviving as they are one step into famine. Total famine is not declared yet, but the UN humanitarian chief said 2 weeks ago at the UN Security Council, and I quote him here saying that Yemen is facing total social, economic, and institutional collapse. The people of Yemen are being subjected to deprivation, diseases, and death as the world watches. Crisis is not coming, it is not looming, it is here today on our watch. End of quote. And I stress on the fact that women bear the greatest burden of war, because 2 weeks ago in Eb city in Yemen, a mother poisoned herself and two of her daughters and committed suicide as the mother had nothing and could not go begging for help. Not to forget that child marriage among little girls is increasing rapidly as a result of the economic devastation and the increasing rate of displacement. A week ago, I called my family in Sana'a, and I was told that one of my old friends' husband just got a new wife. And guess how old was she? She was 15. Midst of all this tragic situation, I would like to share some of the political manifestation done by women, which Eva also shed light on previously. So in this picture, you can see the lady is about to bike as the war began in 2015. In Sana'a, a young activist who I'm very lucky to call her a friend, Bushra al-Fusail, started to mobilize other women to bike and to defy the fuel shortages and the Saudi-led airstrikes and gender stereotypes. Too bad Bushra had to leave the country because of the harassment that she got after this campaign. In the other picture, you can see that women have been really engaged in, not in direct fights, but at least they have been used as promotion of the military side in the conflict. So this picture was taken in Taiz, and normally they are fighting the Houthis. Then also you can find similar pictures in Sana'a for pro-Houthi women who are also like, showing off their military aspect, which is part of like a greater campaign by the Houthis that's called the military effort, or al-Majhud al-Harbi. And women also, pro-Houthi women, have been very active in donating money or sending food to the front lines at the battlefield and so on. Also, in response to the zero representation of women in Yemen's several peace talks, there was Women's Pact for Peace and Security was established by a group of Yemeni politicians and activists, a body that was endorsed by the UN Women. Here in this picture, you can see one of my blog posts that says, Yemen's peace talks, congrats. You have an all-male panel, which is clearly, I was just being cynical of not including, women. Also, massive numbers of forcibly disappeared young men from activists, journalists, and other young men have been detained or abducted by the Houthi men and other extremist groups in different parts of Yemen. The female members or relatives of these men came together and started this association that called Mothers of the Detainees. And I find them like to be one of the most remarkable grassroots groups in Yemen. And I suggest that you make sure to follow them on Twitter. They're very active in raising awareness about the condition of their relatives in jails or abduction. And as I am heavily engaged in media, it concerns me very much the condition of freedom of expression in Yemen. Yemeni press is under heavy crackdown, primarily by the rebels group, the Houthi, and also other extremist militia groups. And this is not also to dismiss that there is a great deal of media blackout on Yemen war, as Saudi Arabia have bought many media houses and international PR companies. So in this atmosphere of no space for free expression, women experience the crackdown in two dimensions. One, because of the general status quo, and second, just because they are females. So in Yemeni public debate, some women opinion leaders are targeted and intimidated just because they are women. And I find it very problematic. This, for example, this picture, it shows you the type of misogyny that is, there in the media discourse. Whenever you want to demean or to make fun of a political leader, you just turn them into a female figure. And this is even seen globally. So this is not something extremely exclusive to Yemen, but I find it very, very disturbing as a female. Now, just to conclude, I think what's very relevant for you here today to know is that we can't talk about women without talking about militarization, which Spain has a huge role in. I'm very grateful for Eva that you raised up Spain's role in Yemen war, which I'm sure not many really pay attention to. But in Yemen war, there have been massive war crimes. So hospitals, mosques, weddings, schools, even funerals have been targeted. And human rights groups have been reported last year that 1 in 3 Saudi air raids on Yemen hit civilian areas. And despite all these reports, Western governments, including countries from European Union, have been some of the top suppliers of weapons to Saudi-led coalition members. And my message here today would be to be enough with double standards from EU countries. enough with preaching about human rights and at the same time collaborating with the state that are committing atrocities with European-made weapon. This can only be reversed by you, the EU citizens, the Spanish citizens, through one, being better informed about the atrocities committed by, say, the Spanish-made weapon or the UK-made weapon and so on. And second, by questioning your politicians, your governments, and writing to them and asking to them, at least ask them, can we investigate how our weapon is being used? At least ask, is it used in a way that violates international human rights laws? The tragedy in Yemen is not natural disaster. It's a man-made disaster. And us, the mankind, can affirm our humanity and work together to end the tragedy. And in this, Yemenis need your solidarity now. And thank you.